Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Joe Austen. Hi, Joe. How are you?
Hi, Kieran. I'm good, thank you. How are you doing this week?
It's the start of term, so naturally very, very tired. But yeah, it's great to have you here, Joe. I think we've been discussing this for quite a while now, and I'm really glad that sort of the stars have aligned and we can get to chat about early mathematics together.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Perhaps I think it makes sense to start a bit with about who you are and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, so I started teaching pretty much straight out of uni. I did a history undergrad, but I'd always been quite keen on maths. I was one of those kids who was lucky enough to be fairly good at it without having to try too hard. So, did my GCSE, did my A level, but I did history for undergrad. While I was doing my undergrad, I did a bit of maths tutoring to make a bit of extra money because living in London is really expensive. So I I sort of, and obviously as you're doing the tutoring, you start thinking, you're pretty bad at it. You're just a history student trying to make a bit of pocket money. But no, it did get me interested, and you start thinking about how can I do this better? How can I make this a little bit more effective? And meanwhile, alongside the tutoring, I was volunteering at a primary school children's homework club in a children's library, and that was really what sent me down the road of ending up doing a primary PGCE straight after university. I was really lucky to Kieran to do a math specialist primary PGCE back when there was actually government funding for it. So a £12,000 bursary just to on top of that, as well as the maintenance loan to actually do a math specialist primary teacher training. And we got a lot of extra input with primary maths. So I was very fortunate in that regard. And then again with my first school, once I was qualified, it was a school that was particularly and this was luck, as with a lot of things. A friend sent me a job application, and I ended up landing in a school that was particularly keen on doing maths in a really effective manner. So again, like in the early years of my career, I got a lot of extra input on how to teach maths as well as possible. I guess I should say that was year one and year two. Most of my background, and we're going to talk about early maths today. And I think that it's important to clarify that when we're talking about early maths in this episode, we really mean nursery reception year one and year two. We're not just talking about EYFS, even though that obviously has the word early in the title, and it's good to clarify. We're really going sort of the whole 3 to 7 kind of journey. And yeah, my most of my background was teaching year one or year two, but I did have some experience doing some bits of work in nursery and reception as well. While I was doing my masters, I did part time. I was doing cover teaching, had a couple of part time jobs. So some of that was in EYFS. And then, yeah, I went to international school, left London for a bit, went to Cairo in Egypt. Pandemic happened, so it was quite an interesting couple of years. Came back, and then once I came back to London, I got a job as a maths specialist teacher, teaching year four, year five, and year six. But yeah, even while I was doing that, the process of teaching those older children, it really just brought home just how important the early maths was, because when those children have got gaps, it's usually because there's some things that aren't quite secure from earlier on. I finished that job this summer just gone, and now I've started a new job very recently um, in East London, and I've now working as a lead practitioner where I still do plenty of maths, but I'm primarily focused on coaching and mentoring early career teachers and those who are doing their initial teacher training.
Fantastic. So a really, really varied experience. And really resonates there when you're saying, your time in 4, 5, 6 taught you the importance, it's only when you understand the frustration of those missing pieces of the puzzle that the whole thing clicks together, I think.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I'd sort of known it in theory, but then you go and do it, and you find that it really is the case. But I was lucky only. I think it was the right way round for me because I'd had that experience teaching the younger children. Um, Hopefully, it meant that I knew a little bit more about what to do when you're faced with children in year four, year five, year six who are really struggling, and you've sort of got the pedagogic subject knowledge. You've got the confidence to be okay. It's fine, and you're not afraid, almost afraid to go back and do some year one maths with them, do some year two maths with them. Sometimes even like have year six kids and you're getting the reckon wreck out and going double one, double two, double three because that's what they need, and that's fine. I think that's one of the big things I'm always advocating for is you know that it's absolutely the right thing to do to go. You have to go back sometimes in order to go forwards.
Did you ever get the situation where you were thinking, who taught these kids in year two? And then when You sort of realize, oh wait, that was me.
No, I never had that. I hopefully wouldn't ever think like that. It's always far more complicated when children are struggling in maths or in any subject. There's a multitude of factors behind that. But um, yeah, no, and it's one of the challenges, isn't it? That when you have a fresh bunch of children, you've got to um you've got to try and work out what has gone before and where those missing blocks are, and that's it's something that it's a we're all learning that you can't ever no one's perfect. It's always that process of trying to diagnose and then respond and adapt and see what's going. That's one of the joys of this job. It's why it's intellectually there's a lot of problem solving. It's not easy. We don't do it because it's an easy job, but it is an enjoyable challenge.
Yeah, and I think early on, in that sort of region that we've sort of said we're going to discuss, there's so much going on, and hopefully we'll get to lots of that. It feels as if you were inspired to really focus your attention on early maths because you could see the importance. But how do you see it shaping a child's overall development and future learning? Is there anything that people need to consider
Yeah,
when you're thinking about the whole journey?
that's a great question. I think, I mean, this might be a bit of an obvious point, but most schools are doing maths every day. And you've asked about how it shapes a child's overall development. If you're struggling in maths, this can really be quite over and over and again, feeling that children, when they're feeling they can't do it, they're feeling that they're being unsuccessful. Um, it can really influence not only their perception of how they are as a learner in maths, but as a learner in general, because along with reading and writing, this is one of the things that we're doing over and over. So it's this sort of headline subject that is so important to get right, because beyond even the maths itself, it can really have a negative influence on children's experience of school. And we know that happy children are far more likely to thrive in general. With the maths specifically, I think it's so clear. There's a lot of evidence. You look at the Education Endowment Foundation, you look at that report they've done into improving EYFS and Key Stage 1 maths. There's a lot of evidence that achievement in early maths is pretty strongly correlated to later school achievement. And Kate Frood, who I think you had on the podcast relatively recently, she has a nice analogy in her book, which I've been reading, the A to Z of primary mathematics. It's a great read. And the J of the A to Z is for Jenga. And she's talking about a Jenga tower where if you've got some wobbly blocks at the base of the tower, you can build the tower up for a bit. You can actually keep building. You can keep putting more blocks on top, but at some point, that tower can't go any higher. And it's a really nice analogy because not only does it say you've got to have a solid base to keep building a really tall tower, it makes that point to the teachers that it is possible. You can plow on with sort of, year 2, year 3, year 4 maths with wobbly blocks, but really that you're putting a ceiling on how high that tower is going to get. So that's a nice analogy, I think. I think the other thing that made me really interested in early maths as an area to focus on is that there's so much potential, there's so much to do, there's so many teachers and nursery workers and teaching assistants and parents who really, really want to support the children to do as well as possible in maths, but maybe haven't always had the opportunity to access as much training and professional development and wider reading or all these things that me and you have probably been lucky to do, because in the system that we're in the UK, it's not always set up for that, and it is totally possible to pass initial teacher training, pass the ECT years, and still not feel particularly comfortable with maths. I recently found a piece of research from an organisation called National Numeracy, and I think I tweeted it a while ago. Didn't get a whole lot of attention, but I think maybe it'll get a bit more attention. I say it now. This thing that National Numeracy did, they studied 11,000 trainee teachers, and they basically found that 43% of the 11,000 were either low in maths skill, i.e., their own maths capabilities, low in maths confidence, or both. And that's a really high percentage. And of those 11,000, 31% of them gave a negative word like anxious or nervous or worried, confused, panic when they were asked to describe how they felt about maths. So I feel like it's a great area for me to be involved with and focused on, because there is a lot to do, and it's a really powerful thing we can do to make to make children more successful, but also to make adults that work with them feel more effective in their jobs. If you look at that EEF report I mentioned earlier, number one of the five overall recommendations is to develop practitioners' understanding of how children learn mathematics. So, we can't all be an absolute expert in everything, but for me, as an area to focus on, it's always felt like there's a lot to do, and that I enjoy maths myself, and I've enjoyed learning to become a better maths teacher, which is obviously very different to being good at maths, just as a kid. So learning how to teach maths has been a lovely thing for me. It's been a thread since I started tutoring as a student when I was in first year of uni, and there's still so much more. There's still so much more to do. So far, what I've said is along the lines of basics are really important. We need to secure the basics, get those early building blocks right, get the, basics, how that affects the children. I've spoken a little bit about how that affects the adults and the importance of the teachers and the teaching assistants, the parents, the early years practitioners. But actually, I think we have to be more ambitious in the long run and have this vision where we're not just doing the minimum and the basics, and we're actually creating a really, really rich, really powerful version of early maths. Mark McCourt, in his book Teaching for Mastery, talks about teach everything correctly first time, and he describes this idea of forward-facing mathematics, where the approaches, the models, the images, the questions, the tasks, that everything that we use has to be geared towards the future maths, not just the maths they need to do now. So we're not trying to just teach exactly what's needed to pass this particular test, this particular level, this particular year group, get them to age-related expectations. No, we need to be better than that, and ultimately have a vision of we're going to teach in such a way that we're setting up for future success in their entire mathematical future, which is going to be, we all know that's going to go at least to 60, and hopefully for many of them it may go further than that. So a couple of examples could be, and I write about this in the book that I've been working on, 4 + 2 = 6. We see that all the time. But how often are teachers presenting 6 = 4 + 2? Because actually both of those are equally valid and equally important ways of seeing, like, look, this is an equation, this is what equals means. Equals means balanced. It doesn't mean write your answer to the right of this symbol, which is the risk. Another really egregious example of a sort of wrong way of doing this, how do you times a number by 10? Stick a 0 on the end. That'll get you so far. It's the sort of classic bad idea, and most people have heard of this one. That is not forward-facing maths, because as soon as you put some decimals on the end of the number, that method is toast. It's not going to work. So I'd certainly encourage people to read that book in its entirety. I'm making my way through it now. It's very important reading. But yeah, Teaching for Mastery by Mark McCourt. That's one of the things that I've taken out of it, and I'm going to actually, when I go to the next maths conference in Sheffield, that's going to be what I'm going to talk about a little bit. This idea of hopefully taking Mark's idea of forward-facing mathematics and applying that to early maths. What does that look like? I think I've just given a couple of examples there, but I'm going to try and say a little bit more about it at the next math conf in Sheffield. I don't know when this is going to go out, Kieran, so maybe that'll be people having to get in their time machine to go back to that. But if this is published before broadcast, what do we say, the podcast? If this drops into people's podcast feed before the 12th of October, come along. It's the maths conferences. I've been to a few of them now. Yeah, like we said earlier, that's where we first met about a year ago. They're really great events. They're not just for secondary school teachers. There's lots that primary school teachers can get involved with there as well. So hopefully we'll see a few of the listeners there.
I consider myself pretty hip in a Steve Buscemi "Hello Fellow Kids" way. So definitely drop is the verb we use. Can't wait for the next episode to drop. So I think that's what we'll go for moving forward. I mean, there's lots in there, and it all ties together, because I think you're only really in a position to be forward facing, and I really like that that sort of that way of looking at things. You're only really ready to be forward facing when you've got really robust subject knowledge, and almost everyone can count, but can they articulate what the sort of the component parts of counting are, traditionally called the principles of counting, but there may even be a bit, further layers there. And so I think that's the way we almost need to think about the development of our teachers is, are you going to be in the very best position to then start thinking creatively? And I think that's when you arrive at things like, we teach too much in key stage one. Let's pump the brakes on
Yeah,
some of
we'll
the
we'll
stuff.
probably get onto that, I'm sure. It's I think there's definitely some things to say there that we'll probably agree on, but we might come to that in due course.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be that every second episode of this podcast was us shouting about the national curriculum. So
Yeah,
who knows what
we'll try and avoid that. No shouting.
What are the key principles or concepts that should form the foundation of early mathematics teaching?
Well, Kieran, I listened to your pretty recent episode on that sort of idea of the phonics of maths. So the easiest thing to do here is to direct people to that and say I agree with pretty much all of it. But that would be a very short answer. So maybe maybe a little summary, and then I'll try and say a couple of other things that might build on what you and the guys discussed in that recent episode. You were talking about the phonics of maths because, and you were debating a little bit about, does the analogy work, and which elements of the analogy do we think are most important. And for me, the bit that jumps out is, look, the success of phonics in schools over the last however many years is that it's putting a lot of emphasis on it. It gives it this status, this importance. Schools invest in the CPD, and it's also crucially seen as an important intervention for older children who are struggling. Like we mentioned, I think earlier on, I'm constantly advocating for, if you've got older children in year 4, year 5, year 6, if they need to go back over the basics, that then do it. So yeah, I think it is a valid analogy, and I enjoyed listening to that episode a lot. I think you discussed the counting principles. People can go back, access that, listen to the explanation that the guys gave. It's really important. Just an example of that. I'm not going to go through all of them again, but something like order irrelevance principle. If you have 6 bears laid out in a line, can the child count along the line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, touch and count? Great. But then you give them a bear in the middle and say, oh, make that middle bear, make that number 1, and can they start from the middle of the line and count the bears in any order? That's a really nice little activity to do. So you've got this set of counting principles. That's one of them. You guys discussed subitizing, take your pick. Um, you discussed, this idea of the perceptual subitizing versus the conceptual subitizing. The perceptual, where you just see it and you see it, 3, that's it. The conceptual subitizing, where you start bringing in the number bonds as well. You see 3 and 3, you know that you've got 6. You also discussed a little bit about number sense, which I might come back to and try and say a touch more about. I think you also talked a little bit about just counting in general, beyond the subitizing and the principles. There's definitely something around, I don't know if it counts as a key principle or key concept. There's something about efficient counting and accurate counting, and actually teaching strategies for that. Can children count from left to right? Can they count top to bottom? Do they move them out of the way? Do they move the objects out of the way once they've counted them, or do they cross the things off on the sheet of paper? Are they starting to go, oh right, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and then maybe there's one more, 11? So not just counting in twos, but then twos and then an extra one. Are they counting, maybe using their 5s if they've got that far? So increasingly efficient, accurate counting is really, really important. It's just underpins everything. I think you guys said quite a lot about number sense. I'm trying to remember, but I find this so important. The children who are most successful in maths, you can basically pick them out by interrogating their number sense. And when we talk about number sense, there's a few different definitions, but number sense is a kind of catch-all term which refers to children's or adults sense of the cardinality of a number, like sort of the fiveness of 5. How big actually is 5? How big actually is 8? How big is 63? So you've got this sense of cardinality. That's part of number sense. This idea of the relative position of the numbers relative to each other in the linear number system. So we can say that 6 is quite close to 4, and 10 is further away. They're both greater than a 4, but 10 is further from 4 than 6 is. So you've got this sort of sense of numbers as part of a linear number system. And there's also, for me, part of number sense is composition of number, which feeds really nicely into the starting to talk about the importance of number bonds. Do children know that 7 is 0 plus 7, 1 plus 6, 2 plus 5, 4 plus 3, and so on. Yeah, it leads us straight into talk about number bonds, that part whole concept, which is so important. It's the number one thing. When you've got older children and they're doing, oh, you've got 630 grams of flour. I want to have a kilogram. How much more do I need to add? And you start seeing people doing 1,000 plus 630. They haven't got that part whole concept, and it comes back to 6 plus box equals 10. Do the children understand that we're not just doing 6 plus 10? And that really is so crucial. I think, yeah, your question was what are the major principles and concepts for the foundations of early maths, and the part whole thing is absolutely essential. Part whole, part whole, whole part whole part. And I learned that in my first school, and those actions are really powerful. You do it with the unifix cubes. You've got the two bits, stick them together, snap them apart. How can you snap it in a different way? Over and over again. Part whole concept and number bonds is really important. The last one I'd probably add, which is a huge area to get into, especially on a podcast, not the best format for it, but spatial reasoning, is there's a load of evidence that spatial reasoning is really closely linked to later achievement in maths. I like the early childhood maths group have got this thing called the spatial reasoning toolkit, which is free to download. If you Google that early childhood maths group and then spatial reasoning toolkit, you'll find it. And it's got loads of really nice examples of activities that you can do. And yeah, I've gradually learned this over my career as well. Certainly, I've in the last few years, there's so many things that you can do that are so important. I think we'll talk about this a bit later, but they lend themselves to really nice sort of playful approaches as well. Things like decomposing and recomposing 3D shapes, 2D shapes, navigation challenges, different discussions, and lots of talk about perceptions of length, different things of positional language. Those particularly in EYFS, but still in year 1, year 2, the spatial reasoning is really important and not to be forgotten, despite the correctly there's an overarching focus on number, but it's really important that we carve out time for like meaningful spatial reasoning, not just sticking it in the last week in December and then actually it doesn't happen because it's the Christmas play.
Sometimes what happens is that it gets conflated with geometry.
Yes, exactly.
Does that resource categorize the different types of spatial reasoning? Because I've read stuff and I've been thinking about elaborating on it, where researchers have tried to almost create a taxonomy where that goes beyond. So almost, we're aware of the different things. Like in development matters, you've got the familiar routes and being able to talk about where you're going on your way home, that kind of thing. But equally, you've got the fitting into spaces.
It's a pretty thorough document. It's basically on the contents page. It goes through executive summary, introduction, development of spatial reasoning, importance of spatial reasoning, supporting children's spatial reasoning, physical development, gesture and language, individual and group differences, environments for spatial reasoning across the curriculum, families, books and spatial reasoning, perspective taking, scaling, navigation and maps. So I do think it doesn't fall into that geometry trap. It is definitely spatial reasoning kind of stuff. So obviously it does link to geometry, does link to shape. Look, exploring and communicating about a range of shapes, spatial language can. But yeah, it definitely does a lot more than just shapes. Have you come across this before yourself or not?
Who is
Not
it?
seen this one. It's called the Early Childhood Maths Group. No, it's very good though. There's lots of good ideas in there.
So yeah, totally comprehensive. You know what I mean? There was no doubt that it would be. The conflation normally happens in the minds of teachers like me on their first day in reception when I went in and what is the spatial reasoning thing, and then you soon find out actually there's so much more to it, isn't there? So yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, yeah,
absolutely.
apologies for taking all the all the good stuff for that phonics of maths episode. Like, do you
Making my job easy, Kieran. It's fine. No, I mean it's good. It's good. I think there's obviously a healthy amount of repetition to remind people, but I think you guys covered it really fully. And it was a nice back and forth between I think the three of you about which bits you found particularly important. And there might have overall I think there was a good degree of agreement in the room. I think the things that we've summarized as well this evening.
It was a tough episode to record because we weren't so clear on what exactly it was we were talking about. So we're all coming from slightly different angles. So I'm glad it's translated, and a few people I've actually spoken to have mentioned that episode in particular. And when you're talking about that counting and that concept of number, you actually remind me of Piaget has a book about the child's conception of number,
Okay.
and and sort of comparable to Gelman and Galistell's counting principles. He tries to outline that sequence, but obviously he comes from a very Piagetian sort of standpoint. And he talks about ordination, which would almost be all those things about ordinality and the sort of the stable order, that kind of thing. And then he has this coordination, which I think is what you're describing, where it's that, it's almost that element of number sense is what am I doing with this? I understand
For me,
cardinality itself.
it's so important, Kieran. I've got a few examples that I could give for this. Few lovely activities. I'm sure a lot of teachers would have heard of these before. You know the idea of an estimation station in reception. You've got a few plastic pots which are sealed with a certain number of objects inside, and throughout the day or the session, the children have to estimate how many are in pot A, how many are in pot B, and how many are in pot C. So they go through that process of estimation, building up their number sense. What is a realistic estimate? Is it more or less than five? Okay. Is it more or less than 10? And then at the end of the session or at the end of the day, the pots are obviously opened and the children and the teacher count together and reveal actually how many were in pot A, pot B, and pot C. It's a super easy activity to set up. It's a very powerful thing to have. So estimation station is really nice because I want to say, I really want to emphasize that children will come into your class at any year group in secondary school or primary school with a different degree of number sense, but it's not like innate. Um, they'll start from different points, but it can be improved. I think sometimes we think of number sense as like just one of those things, like you've either got it or you haven't. It seems like something like just inherent within the person, but number sense can be developed, and these are the sorts of things that we can do with young children. Estimation station, giving them the opportunity to think about. Is it more or less than this? How much could that be? Another one that I really like, which is a really fun game you can play with a small group or a whole class if you're feeling brave, is higher or lower. Which, if you think back to Play Your Cards Right, bit of Bruce Forsyth, you've got a set of cards. You probably might want to take out the Jack, Queen, King, and Ace to help. You can leave the Ace in, explain that that's one, and basically, you pull out a card. Right, is it going to be higher or lower than a nine? You're probably hoping they're going to say lower because the child realizes that there are more numbers in this game lower than nine than there are higher than nine. If you want to make it an adapted version, not using the cards in a different setting, maybe the cards aren't quite so good, or you want to do it with a different, perhaps a smaller, maybe 1 to 6, you can do it with a spinner. So you get a little spinner on a split pin, or however you make one of those. You find a spinner, and the pie chart is split up into 1 to 6. And okay, they've spun a 5. What's then the next player is going to say higher or lower, and hopefully they're going to tell you that it's likely that the next spin will be lower than a 5. So this is another thing for building number sense. The last one that I wanted to suggest, which is again I think quite powerful, and you can actually roll this out to older children. I'll explain how in a second. If you're trying to match a set of numbers to a set of images and no counting is allowed. So let's imagine we've got the numbers 4, 7, and 21, and we've got images that match those with a number of bears or whatever. A child with decent number sense can draw those lines to match without counting a thing, just by looking. They can see which is the big one, that's going to be 21. They can see which is the smallest, and they can match confidently. Obviously, you can adjust the difficulty of that. You can ramp it up by what the numbers are, which images you use. And actually, it's a really powerful thing. I know we're here to talk about early maths, but if you do this with older children where you've got it's like, oh, actually, do you really understand big numbers? You get a picture from a crowd, you get Wembley Stadium. Okay, this is 90,000. You find a smaller crowd in a sort of rally or something where there's 9,000, and you find a crowd of 900, and you get the children to match. And this is number sense, but for maybe a later stage than what we're here to talk about. But it's a really nice activity. And again, it's just building up that sense of number, that sense of cardinality, which is so important because sometimes, that whole curse of expertise as the adults, we've got this quite strong conception that, I come from near Portsmouth, Fratton Park is about 20,000. I've been in there. I can see what 20,000 people look like. I can see what it feels like. For a child in year 4 who's first coming across the idea of 20,000, do they really, that's a really quite an abstract thing. So we've got to constantly look for ways to keep improving children's number sense. even beyond the early years.
You must have been going to Fratton Park in the Premier League era if you saw
Oh,
twenty
I
thousand people
wish.
there.
I don't know what you mean, Kieran. It's hard to get tickets these days. We're back in the heady heights of the championship. Not doing very well so far, but the first 5 games have been. Look at the fixture list. That's all I say to people. We've played all the big guns. Wait for October and November. We'll start getting some more winnable games. Lift ourselves off the bottom.
How can teachers effectively balance conceptual understanding and procedural fluency in early mathematics classrooms?
Yeah, this is a really important question, and I went through the same thing I think a lot of teachers do when they first start teaching. I've got to get the children to understand why. I mean, and that's a really noble aim. That is what we want in the end. We do really want children to understand why, but actually, it's not as simple as that. And some people might have heard of Craig Barton. He's a secondary math specialist. He's written probably the most famous sort of teacher, most famous one of the most famous books written by a teacher in the last however many years, called How I Wish I'd Taught Maths. And it's a long read, but it's excellent, and it's still really, really useful for primary school teachers as well. Like, loads of stuff still applies to primary school. Actually, the majority of it does. And I can't remember which chapter, but he basically writes about how he was the same. When he started teaching, he really wanted the children to understand why, and he really sort of drilling down on the why and trying to make them explain, but why, but why, why does this work? What's that pattern? And he explains how over time he came to the realization that learning the how, the procedural, either just the knowledge of what it is or the how to follow procedure, actually sometimes it is okay if that comes before the children fully understand why. And I'll explain a little bit more in a moment. But yeah, to reiterate, there are, it's different for different concepts and different classes and different circumstances, but there are definitely times where it is okay for the procedural to come before the conceptual understanding. And the chief reason, the biggest reason for this is that if you are doing the procedure fluently, that frees up your working memory to start having brain space to think about why this works, having brain space to spot the pattern, to spot the relationship between this and that. So, whereas if you're still consumed about working out what to write where and what's the next step and all the rest of it, then there's very little chance you're going to spot those patterns. The second thing that I wanted to say was, and I like Craig Barton describes in his book, I also came to this realization that it's not actually as simple as child is fully understanding the concept versus child is literally just following a procedure. It's not that black and white. There's loads of shades of grey in between, because the way memory works and our brains work, we're gradually forging these connections, and we're improving our existing mental model as we keep having more experiences, keep learning. So it's actually totally normal that there's times when the procedural fluency is higher than the conceptual fluency, and then you go back and then you add more to your existing mental model, and your understanding of the concept just keeps getting deeper. And even as a teacher, I'm someone who, like I said earlier, I was lucky that in school maths, I found it all relatively straightforward, did well in a GCSE, did well in an A level. And even now, I work in a primary school, and there are plenty of times where I'm like, and you realize that your own understanding as an adult, my own conceptual understanding, is still developing. So I think that proves the point that it's not it's not as simple as you've got it, you understand why, or you're just at the other end and you're just following procedure. It's both of those things have to be built up in tandem. So all of that is a really long way of saying I totally accept the premise of your question, that both of these things are important. And you actually asked, how do you find the balance? So it's tricky. It is really difficult. But here's a few ideas that I sort of came up with. How do you find the balance? One, actually celebrate and value the procedural knowledge. It is worthwhile and it is worth celebrating, even if the child doesn't fully understand the sort of the deep reasoning around whatever the concept is. You still need to celebrate it and celebrate their achievement of just knowing stuff or just being able to follow the process. That is worthwhile. So there's something to celebrate there. My second point, and this sort of links back to what you said earlier about the going down the road of bashing the curriculum. But if we're going to balance the conceptual understanding and the procedural fluency. We as teachers and as year group teams and as school teams and hopefully as a sort of wider, wider society of all the maths teachers in the UK, it really helps if we have a shared understanding of what is it that's totally essential that we can't let go, that they really do need to have a deep conceptual grasp of at point X, and which things is it that actually it's kind of okay if this slides into you're just following a procedure and we'll deal with that later. So, for example, if we're in year one and children have really weak number sense within 10, that is a problem and it's something we need to work on to address. Whereas if we're in year one and they can't quite understand the concepts around reading the time to half past the hour, you know, do we really mind? Not, maybe not as much. So I think that's the second thing. How do you find that balance? You've got to be really clear-minded and really sort of all on the same page about what are the most essential things that we absolutely have to prioritize. Which concepts is it that we do really need them to understand deeply at this point? Also, I thought that it's not, as we were saying earlier, it's not one or the other. And how do you balance teaching for procedural fluency with teaching for conceptual fluency, deep conceptual understanding? Actually, there's plenty of times where you can do both simultaneously. If I'm asking you to count in threes, Kieran, 3, 6, 9, 12, I could literally just do that out loud, chanting from memory, and you'd be sort of doing your procedural learning of it. But actually, I could also be using one of the many amazing physical or virtual manipulatives that we've got available to us. And I'm on my interactive whiteboard. I've got a 3 numicon piece on the virtual, repetitive dragger. So I'm dragging the threes out 3, 6, 9, 12. And as you and the rest of your classmates are counting, you're seeing little 3 numicon tiles appearing on the screen as we chant in relation to the numbers. So we're building up your conceptual understanding of what it is to count in threes, what the cardinality of these multiples of threes looks like. So there are plenty of times when we can do both in tandem. Also on my sort of list of little strategies or methods for this was to sort of, I don't know if this counts as strategy or method, but kind of like don't overthink it, that it is actually sometimes fine to do a whole lesson where it's just kind of procedural, because you sometimes get really dodgy school leaderships that are like every maths lesson must contain 17 different things. And in that hour, they want you to do all these 17 things and don't forget the problem solving reasoning at the end. Like it's not like that. What do we want to achieve across a whole learning episode, or what do we want to achieve across a whole unit of work? Fine, there's certain things that need to be fitted in, but don't, when you're trying to balance the procedural with the conceptual, don't be too hard on yourself and drilling down into like every single lesson must do all of this stuff. Sometimes, look, if you want to have a whole lesson where children understand what an edge is, what a vertex is, and what a face is of a 3D shape, and all they do is, they touch a load of vertices with their finger on the 3D shapes. They rub their hands across the faces. They run their fingers along the edges. They understand what those things are, and then they count some, and they realize that, okay, cool, a cube has 6 faces, and it has, let me get this right now, 12 edges and 8 vertices. That's great. And that might be the bulk of their lesson. So that's something that I think there's a balance to be struck, but don't overthink it. It's actually fine for some lessons to be pretty majority or almost all procedural. The last thing that I thought about this was that, we're talking about early maths of young children, but there's a little bit of sort of early metacognition to build in, that as the children are gradually getting older, we want to balance these two things. Well, we want them on board. It's not like just the teacher needs to be balancing these two things. Maybe we want the children to start understanding it as well. So we're kind of explaining to them as we go along, persuade them, look, guys, because you're so good at adding and subtracting confidently within 20, that means we can now learn about change from 20p. And we're going to learn this really tricky new concept about change in the shop, but that's because your addition and subtraction is so good. And it's just that sort of constant talk. And as the children get older and older, we do more of this, but you can start them in Key Stage 1, where we're getting them to think a bit about their thinking and explaining some stuff, like our number bonds to 10 as an obvious example, is really, really useful if we just know this, and actually showing them as we go along why that's the case.
It's an absolute minefield, and like you're right to point out there was an underlying assumption that I'm going to move past the dichotomous arguments that normally happen on social media about this. and actually look at strategy. And what you've done is you've given us, I think, a really good grounding and a way to approach our thinking as teachers, because it's based on how children learn, and it's also outlining what's actually possible in the classroom, and I think you're trying to tell this story over an extended period of time, and you just got to think about how does that fit in. And I like your, particularly with sort of three-dimensional shapes. We know how important terminology is because it allows us then to articulate things in a much more succinct and clear fashion. Um,
Absolutely.
and so any sort of reasoning you might want to do about the patterns that exist within shape, if you can't describe those, that's going to be a much more painful experience. So I think you're absolutely spot on. I think you navigated that really well. I think you did.
It's
If I had a round of applause button, I would.
oh, it's very kind of you. It's my absolute pet hate, where you get a school that says every maths lesson must include a whole load of reasoning and problem solving. It's like you need a level of fluency and procedural fluency and knowing what you're talking about before you can solve any particularly interesting problems with it. And when we're talking about problems, hopefully we're talking about actual mathematical problems, not just the same but in a word problem, because that's hopefully not what we're hopefully we're moving past that. Schools are definitely getting a lot better at understanding what reasoning and problem solving should involve, but it does not need to be stuck on the end of every lesson. It needs to be included in each unit of work for sure, but it's about doing it when the children are ready for it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one. Maybe one we could follow up in the future because you mentioned Mark McCourt's book. He obviously talks about mathematical maturation and how leaving a substantial gap between when the pupils encounter this new mathematics. I think it's
Yes.
Colin Foster also talks about mathematical difficulty and problem difficulty and how they offset
Yeah,
each other.
yeah, exactly. I'm trying to think of an example of this, but if you're in year five or year six, and you start doing a really interesting, there's so many interesting sort of problems. The whole magic squares, for example, you can do that with the numbers within 20, and the reason you can get really deep chats with year five and year six about magic squares, if people at home are not sure, it's the ones where you've got a grid and the rows, the columns, and is it the diagonals as well? Yeah, they all add up to the same special magic total, is because the addition is just no trouble at all. They're doing the addition with such ease that they've got the working memory free to actually really engage with the problem. So that I absolutely agree with that. You have to have the problem pitched at a level where they're pretty solid or very, very secure with the maths that it involves.
I think there's a magic square on the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona.
Really?
I'm not sure if it's been finished or not. I don't know if you have to do some of the maths, but obviously the cathedral itself is may never be finished. But there's that the was it Gaudi?
Not sure.
Oh, this is going to test my knowledge of architecture.
It's pub
Um,
quiz. It is pub quiz knowledge.
yeah. But so whoever designed it put these magic squares in, and I think they have some sort of biblical significance as well. So it's almost like next level problem solving for anyone who decides to walk around the outside of the church. I suppose while you're queuing up to get in, you can try.
Maybe the problems get solved a lot more in the summer when the queues are the queues are snaking around for hours.
What role do manipulatives and play based learning have in developing strong mathematical foundations for young children? I think this ties into quite a lot of what we've already discussed in this episode.
Yeah, it definitely does, Kieran. I might take those two things slightly separately, only because I think there's a little bit of a risk that, I mean, one of the risks of manipulatives is that people kind of think um, it's super tied up with play-based learning, and actually these are just, things for children to interact with in a fairly free and exploratory way. Whereas I guess the main point that I'm going to make about the power of manipulatives is that the teacher should be choosing which manipulatives we give to the children. Um, you know, if people don't have the sort of general background, I'd certainly go and Google it. Concrete, pictorial, abstract approach to maths. Manipulatives are a key part of that, especially in the concrete stage. But we're saying that the ultimate aim of the maths is that children have a fluent, abstract understanding of the concepts. So we use the manipulatives as one of the ways to get them from their existing understanding towards that fluent, abstract approach. So, without going really, really deeply into all of the sort of background theory of that, if we start from the position that people understand that manipulatives are a useful thing to use in an early maths classroom, the key point to understand is it's not like, oh, we put them all on the tables and let the children choose and explore and play. The manipulatives are chosen by the expert teacher for a reason, um, because there's essentially a load of really important, powerful mathematical structures kind of baked into the manipulatives themselves. So if you think of like a reck and rec with your two rows of 10 beads, and each row is split into five white, five red, that is a really powerful way of using those two rows to go double one, double two, double three. You're exposing the structure of those doubles equally. Also on the rec and rec, you can see it as slide five and then five and some more, which is a really nice little structure, a composition for young children to become familiar with. This idea of six, seven, eight, and nine as five and some more. Another example would be if you think of pneumocon pieces, baked into the structure of those manipulatives is the power to really expose odd and even because they are laid out in twos and then an extra one. If there's an odd one out, stick it sticking out there. Maybe the two color counters in a 10 frame, you're showing 7 plus 3 with 7 reds and 3 yellows. You flip one counter and the child can see there's still 10, but suddenly it's showing 6 plus 4. You've just changed one of them, but you've got one more yellow, one less red. And the fact that you've got this easily flippable manipulative is a powerful way of exposing these relationships between the bonds. So those are just a few examples, but nearly all the manipulatives that we choose, I don't know, like the bead string with its 10 groups of 10, it's there to expose a certain mathematical structure in that instance. Okay, you want to count to 32 and you can slide 10, 20, 30, then 31, 32. So the power of the manipulatives, it's absolutely crucial, but the deeper thing that teachers, and we're all still working on this, is to gradually understand is which manipulatives am I using at which moment and why. And it goes for Key Stage 2 and frankly secondary school teachers as well. There's so much you can do, and it's not just an early maths thing. You also asked about play-based learning. I sort of take that slightly separately so as not to conflate the two, because with play-based approaches, there is a lot more of an element of children exploring and conjecturing and sort of choosing for themselves what path it's going to go down. There's a really nice book that I've been starting to read by Helen J. Williams called Playful Mathematics for Children 3 to 7, and she explains these things in far more depth than we're able to do here with lovely photographs and examples and proper explanations. But there's a few reasons why play is so powerful, and hopefully I'll do it justice in a little summary. That number one, it's really motivating. Children like to play, and motivation is a really important part of learning. We want children to enjoy coming to school, and playful approaches can be a really helpful thing with that. Helen has a quote towards the start of the book, which I have to find it quickly just to make sure I get it right. But she has this quote that says, "Mathematics could be like roller skating, but usually it is like being told to stop roller skating and come in and tidy your room. This is not a superficial matter." And that's a quote from a paper or a book. What's that? Winter 1992. So quite a long time ago, but it's certainly still true. We want children to be as excited about mathematics as they are about roller skating, and playful approaches can really help with that. Another thing is that it's often a really lovely chance for children to be collaborative. Especially in the EYFS Key Stage 1. We need to build up their social skills, their language skills, just as much as the maths itself. These are really, really important aims for the children in our care, and playful approaches can be really great with that. You've got like sort of early reasoning, problem solving, little tasks for them to do, and you can see them. The best group size is usually 2, 3 at a push, and you can see them sort of collaborating and challenging each other, one checking the other one's thinking. That can be a really, really nice thing to do. I guess one other thing I'd say that I took from Helen's book, the bit I was reading recently, is this thing about schools are so busy and teachers are like, do this, next task, next group in. Whereas actually, when we're just watching them play, the chance to stop and observe and do our assessment for learning just by watching them and listening really closely to what they say and which direction they take the investigation, whether whatever it is, whatever sort of prompt you've put out in the environment, whether it's it's a load of pennies or certain building construction materials, whatever it is, how can you make a maze? There's a really nice one in the book I'm trying to remember, something like can you fit 100 of anything inside this container? There's all sorts of different prompts we can give children to start their explorations, but it's it's very powerful, and like I say, I'm still learning more about it myself, but it is certainly different. It's different to manipulatives because it's somewhere between unstructured or sort of semi-guided by the adult, and there's a different options within that. But I really want to make the point that the manipulatives should be chosen for a particular reason, whereas in my mind, play-based approaches are as much about being sort of prepared, and you have the pedagogic subject knowledge to prompt and nudge as it goes down the angles that the avenues that the children take. Oh yeah, I guess the last thing I'd say is like games, where it's a bit more structured. It's a game, and you've got a dice game or a card game or whatever. And Kate Frood talks about this brilliantly in her book that you've got a dice game, and it's very motivating. They want to do it, and rolling the dice over and over is a chance to really secure those basic facts in a very motivating, engaging context. So children, if you're playing Ludo or some other dice game, Snakes and Ladders, doing that higher or lower game I mentioned earlier, certain logical spatial reasoning games like the one we dropped four in a row in the red and yellow counters into the plastic thing, trying to get four in a row. Children can be quite competitive, and a game is a very motivating context. A bit more structured than the sort of explorations I was talking about a moment ago, but games are very motivating context in which to practice really, really important skills and in which to embed and yeah, really secure those basics that we spoke about earlier.
Absolutely. I mean, I can't remember if it was on a podcast or if it was at a conference, but I was definitely talking recently about how my kids are now using mathematics against me to win games. Because there's a once you beat me at something, you've earned it kind of mentality in this
Yeah,
household.
definitely.
But they go to some extreme lengths whenever we're playing maths based games to to me. So
There's so much maths in so many games. I ran an after school club for a while at one of my previous schools, and it just kept surprising myself with how many different games we could find to play. There's maths in so many things, and it's a lovely thing to have a little box of in your classroom if you're able to um the reasoning and problem solving just in which card should I play next in Uno, or battleships is a really nice one to do. There's so many things, and the great thing, shut the box is brilliant. The one where you roll the dice and you put the little wooden flaps down, and you use your number bonds. There's endless maths games to play, and yeah, children, as soon as you taught them once or twice, they can just get on with it as well. So a really great thing to have up your sleeve for a rainy day.
I think you're absolutely right to separate the two. Certainly they're in the same question, so that I didn't have to ask the same question twice, so to speak. But I think your summary of how we should approach manipulatives certainly ties up with my understanding of the research in that field and stuff. And so I think it's a really sensible approach. And I think, if we're particularly early on, we're thinking about how important experience is and the ability and the opportunity, should I say, to tie those different mathematical ideas together. I think what you've outlined makes a whole lot of sense as well. I mean, we could talk about this for hours, but unfortunately, we've probably both got work in the morning.
Yeah,
And
probably have.
um, but it would be great to continue this conversation further down the line if it has been a totally traumatic experience.
No, I'd like that. That would be good.
So I suppose all that's left to do is say thank you very much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Likewise, yeah, really, really enjoyed chatting. Thanks for having me on.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.